Good morning. Thank you, Frank, for this wonderful introduction. It's indeed wonderful to be back with Frank after 30 years, thinking back to the quite interesting work we did in the Moel Subit, and the work we did then got a lot better after a few duvels in the evening. Of course, I would also like to thank ISOCARP for the invitation to share my thoughts with you. My thoughts, for whatever they're worth, are not going to be very pleasant ones. We are failing. We are failing quite desperately. And I think we know that we are failing. That is the most worrying thing. So what I would like to talk about for the next 45 minutes or so is about the following. That is the strange dissonance, the split between what we know, and again, the previous speaker showed yet again in diagrams what we know. The climate is getting worse by the day. According to the last IPCC report, the sixth one already, there is no hope to keep temperatures below 2 to 4 degrees Celsius this century. And if we're a bit unlucky, which I'm afraid unless we change tack, it will be 6 degrees by the end of this century. Luckily, I will not be there any longer to witness the consequences of that. But at least we can still think about this. We know that. Who does not know these facts? Exactly. While on the other hand, in our planning, policy, technological, and other interventions, we act as if we do not know. Let me just quickly exemplify that before I delve into my argument. Between 1992, and I use 1992 because this was the year of the Rio Summit, the year that allegedly the world woke up to the environmental conundrum it was facing. And today, 2022, and despite 30 years of painful but quite effective construction of a widely held consensus about the urgency of environmental and climate action, who disagrees with the fact that it is urgent and that something needs to be done and it has to be taken seriously, the environmental condition as well as the social condition in our urban and regional planning and policy activities. Everyone agrees. Despite that, despite all the technologies, despite all the plans, despite all the debate on sustainability, resilience, adaptation, circularity, etc., greenhouse gas emissions have increased by 60%. 60% in 30 years. In the COVID year, when we thought the economy was going down, greenhouse gases increased by 6%. We are failing. And often we argue that it is the others who make us fail, right? Big capital who doesn't want to change, recalcitrant politicians who think about their votes, populists who don't care about the environment. But strangely enough, that's not about us. We are not like that. We are caring, ethically concerned, liberal, urban intellectuals who mean well. Yesterday we heard from Simin that we need new imaginaries and new fantasies, and we desperately need new imaginaries and fantasies. But before we can even begin to imagine something different, we really have to critically examine the imaginaries that hold us hostage to the very situation that we're in. That's the argument I'm going to make. So for those who want to doze off, that's all I really want to say. The rest is just filling up time. Now let me see what I can do. So the title of my talk is Beyond Immunitary Planning. uneven socio-ecological urbanization in the planetary city. The key argument is here that, of course, we planners, policymakers have, of course, made some cities or some bits of cities more ecologically sensible, even occasionally more socially just, more sustainable. I live half of my time in Amsterdam. Great sustainable city. I love it. But it is bought at an extraordinary cost of socio-ecological disintegration elsewhere. So my point is going to be that Amsterdam's or Copenhagen's or Oslo, it always comes on top, Oslo, Helsinki's and others, sustainability is bought at the unsustainability of other places and cities in the world. And that has to be taken seriously. Right, 5 points I quickly want to make. I'm going to summarize again what we all know. We are today living in a new era. The old Holocene is over. We're living in the Anthropocene. An Anthropocene which I shall redefine as really an Urbicene, the era of cities. Again, nothing particularly controversial here. But this era of cities, what I shall call planetary urbanization, is characterized by deep and deepening forms of combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe. My sustainability is someone else's catastrophe, often. And I think that this is sustained, and that, of course, we're not the only ones responsible, but we're co-responsible. It is sustained by the de-politicized, techno-managerial planning and policy configurations that characterize planning interventions in the Urbicene today. Then move on how we can deal with that. How can we think planning in a different way? In a socially inclusive and ecologically sensible way. But in order to do that, I think, and I'll conclude with that, we have to traverse, to use a psychoanalytic term, traverse the fantasies that we hold too dear. Because I think that what we think is the solution, not only is it often ineffective, it contributes to make sure that nothing really changes. Welcome to the Anthropocene. I think for an audience like this, I do not have to explain that term anymore. It's now very well established that humans, although this is not true, it's a small fraction of humanity, of humans, have deep geological impact on the future of the Earth system. That's unique. During the Holocene, we humans were dabbling with the top layers of the lithosphere and the lower levels of the atmosphere. Today, we are changing the very physical eco-dynamics of the Earth itself. Deep mining, big dams, climate change, biodiversity transformations, etc., etc. It's, of course, most nicely illustrated by the fact of climate change. We are changing the climate, and we know that. And every single attempt, and many that have been, of trying to deflect the history of the future have failed. This is a graph, you probably can't see it in the back, but it basically shows the expansion of energy consumption worldwide since 1800. The key insight of that graph is that transition to renewable or climate-friendly energies has been negligible and additive. Indeed, fossil fuel extraction and consumption has, as I just said, since 1990 increased by 60%. So much for an energy transition. No chance is going to happen unless we change our urban fantasies. Because it is, of course, the city or urbanization that is the geographical imprint of the Anthropocene. It is cities who are the engines and the drivers of socio-physical global change. We're living, as has been often said, in an age of planetary urbanization. That does not just mean that the majority of people in the world live in cities. Yes, we all know that. No, it means that every single one on Earth is urbanized. This woolen jacket comes from sheep in Mongolia. So the sheep herders in Mongolia are urbanized, are part of the planetary urbanization configuration. And when I get later for lunch avocados, I get connected to the socio-ecological disaster that is happening in Mexico and in Chile. That's what I mean by planetary urbanization. It is precisely urbanization that is continuously deepening and expanding resource use. That is the use of non-human stuff, with all the consequences associated with it. Urbanization is responsible for 80% of the world's resource use and 80% of the world's waste, including greenhouse gases. That's waste too, of course. So therefore, and I think most of us can agree with that, urbanization is the pivot, the alpha and the omega. If you want to think about a socially more inclusive and ecologically more sensitive world. My students, ecologically minded as they are, all want to go to save the Amazon. And I beg them, do not do so. The problem is not in the Amazon or in the forests of Africa. It's in Brussels, it's in Washington, it's in London. That's where you do it, if you want to care really about the Amazon and its indigenous people. So urbanization today is a form of planetary socio-ecological metabolism. And of course that takes place, and we all know that too. You know, it's usually mentioned in passing, right? That this planetary urbanization is structured by capitalist growth and accumulation. Everyone says it, we heard it yesterday too, and then we move on to talk about something else. Psychoanalysts call that fetishistic disavowal. It's like the fetishist who prefers a shoe or an underwear rather than the real thing. That's what we do. While we do know that capitalist growth and accumulation, growth for growth's sake, which we do know is ecologically disruptive and socially unequal, is the driver of deep geophysical and socio-ecological transformations. And again, this is an illustration of the ecological footprint of cities. Well known, what the figure shows, if you can't read it in the back, is that all cities' footprints are gigantic. And that's not just in the global north, but also in the global south. My preferred picture is this one. This is lifted from a book that Bill Gates, of all people, did a few years back. But I think it's quite illustrative of the situation. It's a graph that stands for urbanization. It's the use of concrete in the United States and in China. The United States poured 4.5 gigatons of concrete, and that stands as a metaphor for urbanization, for steel, concrete, buildings, airports, ports, highways, freeways, etc. It used 4.5 gigatons. That's a shitload of concrete. Look at LA, Las Vegas, Chicago, etc. in 100 years. In 100 years. China used 6.6 gigatons. Not surprisingly, given the mega urbanization that is taking place in China, where you have 20 cities, more than 10 million people, 100 cities, more than 1 million people, use 6.6 gigatons between 2011 and 2013. Now, try to compensate with that, with local circularity, recycling, or whatever else you want to do. Now, we can blame the Chinese here, because they are not careful enough. Those bloody communists don't know how to do things. Don't forget, of course, that this urbanization is to feed us, half of it at least. 80% of the world's consumption basket comes from China. And the rest stays to feed and clothe and house the local people. Soon it will be Christmas. We will decorate, at least some of us, our houses with Christmas trinkets of all kinds. 99.9% of that comes from Guangdong. You have any idea how much water, sand, and other stuff has to be mined, mobilized, appropriated, expropriated, accumulated to sustain this? So cities, now back to cities more generally, or intensifying metabolic vehicles. I love this word, metabolic vehicles. It's from Paul Virilio, Italian theorist. Of intensifying metabolic vehicles, of transforming socio-ecological relations. They provide the infrastructures of the Urbicene, so to speak. The socio-physical technological intermediaries through which my jacket comes here or my iPhone works. Oh, by the way, do you know how much our IT economy costs in carbon footprint? No one ever talks about that. Yeah, everyone talks about stop flying, flight shame, don't fly. You're messing up the environment. And international flying cost is about 2.5% to 3% of greenhouse gas emissions. Way too much. Our daily use of the internet and email, about the same, 2.5%. Shall we reduce our internet exchanges to save the planet? The mining of bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies use as much energy, usually fossil fuel energy, as Italy and Czechia combined in a year. For the development of a currency that's a purely speculative thing that makes some people extremely rich, but that fucks up, excuse my French, the environment. Now, in order, we, planners, policy makers, have come up with all manner of fantasies to deal with these intensifying metabolic vehicles. Development of a smart urbanity. I've actually never visited a stupid urbanity. We never talk about stupid urbanity, only about smart urbanities. Yeah. Full of all manner of fantasies, phantasmagorias, I call them. Eco-development, big data analysis, retrofitting of eco-technological systems, adaptation and resilience, circularity. I couldn't have a library big enough to put all the documents in that repeat those same empty fantasies time after time again, but which do ultimately very little. That is the sort of things, yeah, that are mobilized on how to produce a socially inclusive, a creative, and ecologically sensible city, etc. What is not or rarely considered is the socio-ecological cost of producing these dystopian urban conditions. Well, dystopian for some, not for me. I love it. I use my Google all the time too if I want to get from A to B wherever I am, just like you do. But we do know that that comes at a cost. Occasionally, it hits us. Yeah? Everyone knows that picture, right? When the Evergreen, 40,000 containers, plus dozens of ships behind it, stuck in the Suez Canal. That's when the fragility of planetary urbanization comes to the fore at its full. The world's logistical change, that's the official word. Yeah, logistical change, logistical planning, it's really boring stuff. But really vitally important because these logistical chains that make our cities work and function. So secondly, this urbanization that I just sketched leads to what I would argue, many others with me, to a combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe. It's combined and uneven. That means some people are negatively affected and others are positively affected. In other words, what I'm going to conclude is the people of humanity does not exist. But the first point I want to make is that is the mirage of sustainability. We're all, most cities in the world, actually, are in a variety of ways, trying to produce a sustainable urbanity. And some are better than others. Amsterdam, Oslo, Copenhagen, etc. My point is that very often, not always, there are exceptions to that, that the making of sustainability in some places produces unsustainability elsewhere. So the dominant fantasy sustains the reality of what my colleague Ingolfur Bludoren of the University of Vienna calls sustaining unsustainability. Similarly, the phantasmagoria of circularity. Yes, we do live in a circular world, but it's planetary. And most attempts to localize or regionalize that, however welcome and important they are, do not misunderstand me, are less than a drop on a hot plate. So we have to delve into the fantasy of planetary urban health and environment and understand that, I would argue, see the reality of its combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe. First of all, we should fully endorse and admit that we are addicted. Now some of us, to fossil fuels and continue to be. As the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is 415 ppm, never seen in the history of the Earth, testifies to. And of course, the past few months have brought to the fore the centrality still of fossil fuels. No one speaks any longer about climate change while we're scrambling to get gas and oil, sometimes from very unsavory, sometimes even more unsavory regimes than the ones that are closing the tap. Putin is correct, and we're not taking this seriously. The production of eco-prophylactic technologies, electrical vehicles, windmills, solar panels, smart urbanity that makes things more sustainable, is of course yet predicated upon what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession and continuous land and resource grabs. It has to come from somewhere, the stuff. Think of, for example, the lithium for electrical batteries. Without that, no electrical vehicle. Cobalt, copper, columbine tantalite that drives every single piece of IT equipment, and much of our foods. Lithium batteries produce a socio-ecological disaster in places like Chile. Water pollution, theft of indigenous land. Avocados. I can't go to a salad bar in Amsterdam or Manchester, where I usually am, without having to eat these organic, vegetarian, climate-friendly superfoods. Avocados and quinoa, right? Everyone familiar with them, right? That's part of a kind of sustainable, woke lifestyle, right? It's tasty, it's good, it's healthy, and it's fine for the environment. We know it's not true, it's a lie. It's producing gigantic water theft and water problems in Chile for avocado. and a gigantic catastrophe in the Andean highlands, where quinoa is produced. These are coltan mines. But 60% of the coltan, columbine tantalite, that powers my and your mobile phone comes from the Great Lake area in Central Africa. Each time you buy a computer, I buy a computer or two or three, you put a Kalashnikov in the hand of a teenage black kid of the militias protecting the mines for usually the Chinese now mining companies, but not only Chinese. I don't want to single them out. We're all implicated. Who does not have a phone here? Precisely, myself included. And of course, when the circular configuration is completed and we buy a new phone, I do every 2 years, 3 years or so, as you do, we don't throw it away. That would be scandalous, would it not? No, we take it to the recycling center. Where is the great recycling company for IT equipment in Belgium, Holland, France, England, Sweden, or wherever you roam from? That's where it is. And we know that too. Most of the world's IT waste ends up for recycling, quote unquote, in the shantytowns of the world's urban mega peripheries. I don't have to paint the socio-ecological consequences of our smart, sustainable urbanity. Not to speak of our clothes. Where do they go when we discard them eventually? Well, this is the world's largest global clothing dump and the recycling center in Ghana. 60,000 tons a day for recycling. So much for eco-sensible development. So, what I think animates a lot of urban interventions, and not all, I really do not want to overgeneralize, but the hegemonic or the dominant ones, is that they focus on technological, managerial, and socio-institutional adjustments in order to make sure that nothing really fundamentally has to change in the socio-ecological order. They are there to produce a prophylactic drive. They make it possible for some to live healthily, sustainably, and in an ecologically sensible environment, which is exactly what I mean by an immuno-biopolitical fantasy. It's about constructing a sustainable, resilient, and adaptive urbanity for some. A few years back, I was at a seminar to discuss the consequences of climate change on cities. And it was in Amsterdam. And it was me and activists and hydrologists, engineers. And I said, look, you know, for Amsterdam it's an issue too, given its location. And the hydraulic engineer looked at me and self-confidently said, and I believed him, you are right, Professor Swyngedouw. Yes, the oceans will rise. But we, hydraulic engineers, can deal with up to 6 meters sea level rise. After that, it gets difficult. I believed him. Holland can do it. Not sure Bangladesh can, but that's a different story. This production of an immunological fantasy, we can save ourselves and our cities, our neighborhoods, is sustained by what Ionots have called empty signifiers, which produce a phantasmagorical vision that assumes that there can be a symbiotic relationship between society, economy, and ecology. Not true. Has never been shown, not once, in a capitalist, growth-based economy. Circularity, transition, A healthy environment for all, as the theme of this conference says. See, that is our dream images. So this immuno-biopolitical fantasy that drives a lot of urban policy and planning interventions call for radical technical managerial change, but not for radical social change. That is too difficult, too hard, too traumatic, literally, to contemplate. It's sustained by an injunction to biopolitical happiness, which is what the political and economic elites promise the whole time. But ultimately leads to what Lieven de Kouter, a Belgian urban philosopher, calls the capsular city. And precisely that's what I often feel I live in, a capsular city. So for the author of Immunological Biopolitics, it's a term I borrowed from Roberto Esposito, Italian intellectual. For him, it's the concentrated form of biopolitical neoliberal governance. He says, the more humans, as well as ideas, languages, and technologies, and other non-human stuff, communicate and are bound up with one another, the more necessary preventative immunization as counterweight becomes, until it's the coagulating point of contemporary life. He wrote in 2008, he did not know about COVID yet, which would bring that to new heights. Actually, the COVID-19 city is a splendid illustration of immunological sequestration. Did you not feel immunological sequestrated during the COVID highlight? Well, I certainly did. And do you know what? I liked it. I was safe. I still got my salary at the end of the month. And I had all sorts of people delivering my food on the doorstep. So the state-centered immunological urban biopolitical governance that marked the COVID-19 pandemic was characterized by a profound socio-ecological triaging. In Manchester, for example, BAME groups. BAME stands for Black, Asian, and other minority ethnicities. I mean, everyone is not white, basically, right? They had 4 times higher chance to get seriously ill or die. And that's not surprising. They kept the metabolic vehicles of urban life going. The delivery services, the food services, essential services in hospitals and elsewhere. A lot of thanks they got for what they did after the pandemic is allegedly over. Of course, also characterized by very uneven and combined prophylactics. I had already 3 times vaccine. Millions literally are still waiting for their first vaccine. Talking about urban health and socio-ecological justice. It's characterized by gigantic territorial national fragmentation. So we see what we're witnessing increasingly, and often in the name of ecological sustainability and social justice, is the construction of uneven urban e-pods, not iPods, e-pods, ecological pods. As Garcia put it, an immunitary power takes control of the risks, dangers, and fragilities of individuals to make them live in a peaceful manner while obscuring any form of dissensus. I'll come back to that word later. As Maria Kaika put it, the immunized, that's mainly us. The immunized become mere spectators of the suffering of others from the cocoon of their sanctuary spaces, from which only hatred of the other, xenophobia, etc., or distant compassion. Don't we feel compassion with the eco-refugees that try to cross the Mediterranean? You see them in Brussels walking around too. We feel compassion, don't we not? Right? That is the affective condition. They're just flip sides of the same immunitary distanciation. So immunitary planning is about the sustainable production of unsustainability. As I said, socio-ecological sustainability is often at the cost of dysregulation elsewhere. I call it the Norway syndrome. Norway as a country and Oslo as a city always are number one on the top of most sustainable cities and most sustainable countries. Which it is, which is a fantastic achievement. But we do know at what price it was able to do so. Norway has the largest sovereign wealth fund, bigger than Saudi Arabia, who of course only keeps it for the elites. Norway is much better than that. Right. But it is true, the pumping up of gigantic volumes of gas and oil polluting the earth and changing the climate, that's how Norway produces and succeeds in securing its sustainability. But that's just an extreme example that many other places and cities around the world can recognize. Now, my point is that this is a fantasy that does not work. Although it provides the illusion of immunitary distanciation, it will ultimately hit all. As Derrida once argued, immunity turns into autoimmunity. The pharmacon of the epochs of adaptation and resilience may turn into a poison. What we see happening is the move from a situation that Foucault defined in the 19th and 20th century, a situation of make live and let die, is today make live and make die. There are 15,000 refugees on the bottom of the Mediterranean. We made that happen. So to begin to conclude, how can we think differently? Let's first of all to acknowledge, to take the courage of our intellect, of the knowledge and truths that we know, but try to hide or repress. To acknowledge that urban interventions are invariably combined and uneven, although often displaced and decanted elsewhere. The citizen for whom we all do it does not exist. Some citizens will benefit, others will pay. So we have to break through the immunological fantasy and move from the us versus them to a global humanity. I'll come to that in a second. And that can be done quite easily in many ways. Simple technologies can do so. Most of our ecological and social indicators that we use, and I heard a fantastic story yesterday about health and transport, etc., or territorial. It takes a city as a bounded territory, and we seek for the data we need on pollution, on green stuff, on carbon emissions. So Manchester wants to be carbon neutral by 2035. It will not succeed in doing so, but it has that nice fantasy. How does it calculate it? By calculating the CO2 emissions of the city of Manchester. That's a lie. Much of the carbon emissions that make Manchester or Brussels or Amsterdam function are emitted elsewhere. Arrive in Manchester in the form of cars or iPhones or food or clothing, etc. Of course, Europe sees a reduction in CO2 emissions because we have decanted our consumption to the global south, the production. Let's calculate the flow of stuff and the uneven production of ecological externalities as well as social implications. Be sensitive to who pays and who gains. Yes, politicians have to pretend it's for all. We know better. Every decision is for some and not for others. Let's acknowledge that, because we do know that's the truth, is it not? We have to stop counting alone, or just counting, and include accountability. Who do we want to be accountable for? Who do we want to stare in the face and say, I did what I could? I do not want to stare Elon Musk or Donald Trump in the face. So we have to recognize in how we plan locally, the interventions we make locally, the technologies we produce locally, the combined and uneven socio-ecological consequences, the effects on other places and cities in the world in a context of planetary urbanization. In order to do that, we have to do something very difficult, I think. That is to traverse our fantasies, the thing that keep our life professionally and personally coherent. And I do this in the spirit of what the French philosopher Badiou a few years ago controversially said. He said, ecology is the new opium for the people. It's a kind of argument that if we can get the climate right, we will have a socially harmonious and ecologically sensible world. That's, of course, nonsense. So there are 5 things, very briefly, that I want to highlight. Less than 5 minutes, yeah. That is to articulate in what we say, what we do, what we plan, the real of our urban socio-ecological models. Not to repress, disavow, ignore uncomfortable yet truths. An electrical vehicle in Brussels is fantastic. For Brussels, for its local pollution, what is the cost elsewhere? Secondly, the ecological argument is made on the assumption that it's not too late. It's 5 to 12, but we can still do something. The catastrophe is still to come. I think that is the great lie. The catastrophe has already happened. Not for you and me, mostly. Actually, for many people, invariably the poorest, the catastrophe has always already happened. There is no catastrophe to come for many. They already live in the ruins, the social and ecological ruins of our time. What would our urban models for Brussels, London, Kinshasa, or whatever else look like if you were to start from the view that it's too late, the catastrophe has already happened, there is nothing to be saved? So the future, in other words, has already arrived. That's what, for me, the name of the Anthropocene, Urbicene stands for. And to fully endorse that. That changes the vantage point of how we think what we do, what kind of technologies we need, and what kind of policies we need radically, I would think. The third sort of legitimation of our concern with health and the environment and ecology is that we have to save humanity. That we have to do it in the name of humanity, which is based on the assumption that humanity exists. Humanity not just as a world population, but in the kind of Western European sense of a humanity with shared civic, human, ethical values. Of course, humanity does not exist, has never existed. The extreme horror of violence, ecological and social violence inflicted by some people over other people testify day after day after day for the absence of humanity. It's precisely the conflicts, struggles, and others that produce the ecological nightmare within to begin with. So let's give up on the fantasy that humanity exists and try to fight politically for the construction of a humanity. Because that's our only hope. It's either that or barbarism. Now, the construction of a humanity, which means giving up on the notion that humanity exists, is the political process. And we have good examples that are great pockets of humanity out there, but they're small, under continuous threat. How do we spread it? How do we generalize it out? How do we construct, in other words, a people as the political category that is concerned with the construction of a humanity? Because without that, there is no hope for a healthy, ecologically sensitive, and socially just world. So this is my final slide to conclude. So to the extent that there is an earthly urban politics possible, I contend that will have to be one that attests to the heterogeneities that cut through the social, that destabilize any community, that interrupts the order of the sensible, as Rossier said, the kind of things we take for granted, that subtracts from existing relational frames, and that takes political sides, and in doing so, proposes and works through forging new, more egalitarian, human, non-human entanglements. That is our challenge. And it's really not a choice, because the alternative, I hope I will not live to see it. Thank you very much.